And now please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Well, the Christmas music has been playing for the last 3 or 4 weeks. You go out shopping, there are decorations in all the stores. This can only mean one thing: Advent is upon us. Now, Advent is one of these churchy words that folks out in the world out there might not know very much about. And so I want to make sure that you, as good Christians here at the Hills Church, know a little something about Advent. The word Advent comes from the Latin word adventus, which means arrival. I know all you Latin scholars out there knew that. And so during the season of Advent, we remember and celebrate the arrival of Christ in the manger. But since the early church, this time has also been a time when we wait for the second arrival of Christ, the second coming. If you look at any of the texts, the other texts that are offered on this day, the first Sunday of Advent, they're these pretty dark and gloomy texts about really, really bad things happening, culminating with the arrival of the Son of Man in clouds to set the world right. It's such a disturbing text that most often, like this morning, you don't hear many Protestant churches reading it. No one likes to feel as they come in and there's all this Christmas stuff to read this dark passage about doom and gloom. So what do we do with this whole second coming business? What do we make of it during this season of Advent when we're supposed to be awaiting this? A lot of theologians have wrestled with it. Liberal theologians 100 years ago were happy simply to dismiss it as something of mythology. But theologians in the mid-20th century said, there's something here. We can't just throw it out. There's something here that we have to take seriously. What is it? Probably my favorite interpretation of this comes from the great German theologian Paul Tillich, who you heard me mention before. Tillich said, he said, when you talk about history, they're the events that go on, but history is always a matter of interpretation, and different people interpret history in different ways. You have your own personal histories that you interpret, how you would tell the story of your life to someone else. If someone were to ask you about the history of this church or this country or this community, you'd give some narrative based on a particular way of reading the facts, the events that happen. The same thing is true with Christians. When Christians tell the story of the events of time, they have a particular lens through which we do that. And for Christians, the center of that story is the incarnation, is Jesus, the spiritual presence that was manifest in him and those around him 2,000 years ago. And so for Tillich, he says, when we think about the second coming, when we think about the kingdom of God and the advent of the kingdom of God, what we're doing is we're interpreting the events communally through that lens of Jesus. We're looking for the spiritual presence that changed the community and the world 2,000 years ago to reappear in some real way in our society today. One of the ways he explained it is he lifted up the Greek notion, the two different Greek words which are used for time. I know Judy mentioned this a little while ago in one of her sermons. In Greek, there's the Greek word chronos, which is chronological time, as events happen. Oh, this service will be 2 hours and 15 minutes. Chronos time. Kairos time, though, is, it's time to go do something. The time is now. So now is the time to be in church, Kairos. And so Tillich said that when you think about this second advent, there are those Kairos moments. There are those times where the spiritual presence of Christ is there, changing society, changing the world. That all of a sudden, things are going along in one way, and then things just seem to shift in a different direction almost overnight. And there seems something spiritual about it. So take, for example, the civil rights movement in the United States. You have decades of struggle for civil rights. And then seemingly almost overnight, in a period of maybe 4 or 5 years, everything shifts. And there's this sense in society in the early 60s that something's changing. And again, this is always with tribulation. The biblical texts tell us that. But there's something that's there. Another example might be the end of the Cold War. Cold War, all of a sudden you have communism for decades. This great struggle between the free world and the communist world. And then seemingly overnight, everything just shifts. Where people stand up and struggle for freedom, democracy, the right to self-determination, and it just happens almost as overnight. There's this spiritual presence that's there. People that are involved in it know that something's going on, something beyond themselves. This is what Tillich is talking about. These are moments that Christians wait for, pray for. These moments of arrival of the kingdom of God, when they show up. That's why the psalmist, the text that Jim just read a moment ago, the psalmist is saying, "Restore us, O God. Let your light shine that we may be saved." This is a plaintive call that Christians lift up at this time of year. Restore us, O God. Let your light shine that we may be saved. Let true justice happen. I know it can. Christians are fundamentally hopeful people. In some ways, we can figure out a way to fix our problems. Some way we can potentially figure out what to do about the climate crisis, or people who don't have health care, or some of the conflicts that are going on in the world. And even though we can't predict or bring about when those spiritual moments will happen, what Christians do at this time is we wait. We wait and we look for small signs of its dawning, for small signs of the spiritual presence still being there. That's one thing I actually do like about this season, in spite of the materialism of it. So often in this season, there does seem to be some sort of spiritual presence there that underlies things, that you see this coming up in people's incredible generosity that comes up this time of year, where people are more generous this time of year than at any other time. This is the time of year where people start caring more about those in need than they do at other times of the year. You wish it happened every time of the year, but I'm grateful that it happens this time of year. You see an example of that spiritual presence coming through, that little glimpse of a dawning of something else, that something else might be possible, that God might be there, present in the world, working. And Christians see that and want to name it, where you open up your table to invite people in who might not be invited in the rest of the year. This is what we do. We can say those lines, "Restore us, O God, let your light shine that we may be saved." And it's particularly important that we bear that in mind, because we all know that this season comes with its own stresses. If you're a parent and you have to go out and buy gifts on top of everything else, all the decorating in the house that you go through for just a few weeks of the year. There's the parties and social gatherings you're expected to go to. Maybe you're traveling this season. Maybe you're hosting family or friends. You seem constantly busy and harried. It's the end of the year. There's lots of end-of-the-year stuff to be done at work or personally. It's cold and rainy outside. We're much more likely to get sick. I mean, this is a time of year where illness comes in. And then there's the reality of grief. If you're missing someone in your family, someone that you love, even if they died many years ago, this is the time of year where you feel it most acutely. This can be the time of year of the most intense sadness. And so it's because of some of these struggles during this time of year that it's so important that we lift up as Christians this sense of Advent, this sense of "Restore us, O God, let your light shine that we may be saved." That when you're feeling down or stressed, you can repeat that mantra to yourself throughout this season to remind you to look for those instances of where Christ's presence is there. To enact that yourself. I guarantee you'll have times this season where you feel just down and out and stressed out and like, I really want this season to be over. Think about this text, "Restore us, O God, let your light shine that we may be saved." Recently, I was reading a sermon from my mentor at Harvard, Peter Gomes, a sermon that he preached on Advent 1, many years ago. And he had this wonderful line in it where he said, "Tell me your expectations, and I'll tell you what kind of person you are and what kind of world you're prepared to live in." Tell me your expectations, and I'll tell you what kind of person you are and what kind of world you're prepared to live in. Christians have expectations of the spiritual presence of Christ showing up to make the world a better place. Christians are fundamentally hopeful people, and the world they're prepared to live in is one full of generosity, love, peace, and kindness. Restore us, O God, let your light shine, that we may be saved. Now, in a moment, we're about to sing one of my favorite Advent hymns, Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence. It's appropriate on this day because originally it came from the communion liturgy. Originally, it's a liturgical moment where Christians, as they gather around the table, keep silence as the presence of Christ comes to them in the sharing of the bread and cup. And then, about 100 years ago, it became adopted as an Advent hymn as well, because that's the same thing that we look forward to. Let all mortal flesh keep silence, as with fear and trembling we stand, awaiting for the presence of Christ in our life. Restore us, O God. Let your face shine, that we may be saved.